Is it already starting? Okay, good day to you all. Just a quick word that this is another session of Friends of Multilateralism Group, FMG, on the recent deals and in the background, of course, the trade tensions. So I will immediately give the floor to Stuart because we have a lot to discuss and many questions to ask. So Stuart, floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lou, and welcome everybody to this session, which we've described as being on the US, UK, and US China deals in inverted commas. Although you know, in one case, I think it's a document setting out the general terms of an economic prosperity deal in the case of the UK, and then for China, I think it was just a joint statement on the US-China economic and trade meeting in Geneva. So we're using deal as very much as shorthand, I think. We have three very distinguished panelists. I'm not going to introduce them in any detail because they're regulars on our programs and their CVs have already been circulated. But we've got, first of all, Alan Wolf, and then Ignacia Garcia Becerro, and of course, finally, Xiangkun Liu, our not only panelist, but also CEO of the Friends of Multilateralism group. So that's great. I think, you know, we had these two deals, the first one with the UK on the 8th of May, and then the joint statement US-China on the 12th of May. It's all very fresh. And I think we're all kind of searching to find out what it all means and where we're headed. There's a lot of questions. And I'm going to start off just by asking a few questions, which I'll put to the panel, and I'll leave it to them to answer to the extent that they want to. I hope that I'm sure they will actually address some of the questions that I'm going to raise. So here goes with 4 or 5 questions. The first one I'm going to ask to the panel as a whole are the US deals with China and the UK likely to provide templates for deals with other countries? And does that mean that we're effectively going back to an era or a system of managed trade bilaterally? And is this managed trade syndrome, I'm going to call it that, likely to take hold more broadly? In other words, is it going to spread out like an epidemic and everybody will be doing bilateral managed trade deals with each other? Secondly, I noticed that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that the US does not want a generalized decoupling between the two biggest economies in the world. I thought that was a major statement. But what the US apparently does want is a decoupling for strategic necessities. And I think steel, critical medicines, and semiconductors were mentioned in that context. So my question here is this good news or bad news for the global trading system? It seems good in the fact that we don't want generalized decoupling, but then what is strategic decoupling? Thirdly, it seems to, I think it's fair to say that the outcome of the recent meeting in Geneva between the US and China exceeded expectations. Both sides have put a positive spin on it, and channels of communication have been or are going to be rebuilt. So what are the chances of building further on this start in the 90-day tariff pause? Are we going to be looking at a phase 2 deal? And will this be any better or more successful than we had in phase 1? And do the ongoing Section 232 investigations have the potential to undermine the progress that's been made? Then my fourth question is on the UK US deal, or an arrangement or a document defining general terms. This has been fairly heavily criticized by some observers, some of them actually FMG members, as undermining the multilateral trading system, of which the UK has always certainly regarded itself as a major proponent. Is this criticism justified, I wonder? Are others likely to follow a similar path? The current indications I think we've seen from the EU and Japan seem cautious to maybe negative. Or is this overdoing it in terms of criticism? And in fact, is what we've got in terms of the arrangement or document from the US and the UK just firing the starting gun for negotiations? Next, the US and UK agreed to cooperate on the security aspects of their economic relationship, which is widely seen as meaning that they'll try to reduce their reliance on China. But China has come out quite strongly to warn that cooperation between states should not be conducted against or to the detriment of the interests of third parties. It seems likely, however, that the US will try to replicate this approach in other deals. And my question here is, how are countries, for example, in Asia, going to react to that? Are they going to be asked to choose between the US and China? And then finally, coming to the WTO, which is our raison d'etre in the FMG, of course, business leaders quickly decried and criticized the unpredictability in the international trade environment in recent months, the frequent and rapid changes in tariffs, for example. But they haven't rushed to the defense of the WTO. In fact, just this morning, I was looking at a post from a company called Penta Group, which actually I do a little bit of work from. They're a global consulting company, and they're reporting on the system, the feeling in Asia, in the Asian business community. And they said, whilst the recent announcement between the US and China offers a huge relief and has bolstered market confidence, without a comprehensive binding trade framework, investors and businesses remain uncertain and on how long this truce will last and if it will lead to something permanent. So kind of totally missing from that comment and from the conversation is the WTO, that they somehow haven't kind of realized that we have a thing called the WTO around. I thought that was interesting. And then just to wrap that one up, after the last era of managed trade in the 1980s, we launched the Uruguay round and created the WTO. As we know, there continues to be a lot of talk about WTO reform, but there's little action. So have we reached the stage where we need to think again about more radically reinventing the multilateral trading system? So that's my last question in relation to the WTO. So that's enough for me. And so now we're going to turn to the panel. They might want to answer some of those questions, but I'm sure they've got their own points to make as well. So we'll have an initial round of interventions and then we'll see where we go from there. So could I give the floor to you, Alan, please?
Certainly. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with this group. And you put the questions, excellent questions, to which we don't have all the answers yet by any means. We're in a time of suspension of tariffs to a degree with China and to a degree with the UK, not getting rid of the Trump tariffs in the second Trump administration, nor the first, in the case of China, the first Trump tariffs in the first administration. So we have to remember there's a 49% tariff in place against China across the board, 19% from the first Trump administration that Biden didn't get rid of, and another 30%. And, this is seen as a a rout by Trump, but there's this 49% tariff that's still in place. And then, as of this last couple of days, on so-called de minimis shipments, those under $800 value, that's now at 54%, which is no small tariff, or $100 flat rate per parcel. Well, that's also quite large. And what's happening? The containers are loading up, which I don't understand. Economists among you and China watchers can explain it. Maybe our president can explain it. The number of TEUs, the container equivalents, 20-foot container equivalents, which were 5,000 on May 5th, have jumped up to 21,530 most recently. So trade is continuing. That's very interesting. So is it a 45% tariff? Okay, not a problem. That's hard to believe. What do we know from the deal? We know that there are exceptions for, or will be on the U.S. side, for trade cases. So steel and aluminum are exceptions. Autos is exception. Copper, lumber, semiconductors, consumer electronics, which is going in the other direction to its exemption from the tariffs. Critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, aircraft, now even movies. There are a whole variety of, you may call these things strategic. Of course, movies are strategic. We have to have some relaxation in a period of trade war. So we'll see. And so I don't know what the trade effects are going to be of all of this, and neither does anyone else. At the same time, the U.S. major, in terms of domestic law, the president's major authority, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, is under challenge. There's been an oral argument this last week in the Court of International Trade. And if he doesn't have authority, does he turn to the Congress? First of all, it may go up to the Supreme Court. It's in the Court of International Trade. It'll go to the Court of Customs and Patent Appeals. Sooner or later, there are 7 major cases, and there are more out there against these tariffs. It's not as if people want to pay these things, so they are challenging them. Does the president go to the Congress? Because the domestic legal authority doesn't matter what the domestic legal authority is if you get new legal authority from the Congress, if they bless the tariffs. On the UK front, the 10% base sticks, the base rate, that's dramatically new. I would say it is a template that every discussion with every other country, I think, will say on the part of the U.S., well, of course, we're going to have a 10% tariff, and then we'll talk about anything above that, especially with the EU, where there's no love for the EU in this current administration, and it's at a 20% rate. Does it get down from a 20% rate? How does that? I mean, a major issue for the world economy is these major trade partners, the EU and the US. Can the EU buy down the rate or retaliate its weight away from the rate is a major question. It's highly fluid, and there are lots of other subjects out there, including with the UK. That's a moving target. The digital tax, giving the UK better treatment on pharmaceuticals than it's looking for it. I mean, the deal, the US UK deal is a template for the further negotiation, for one thing. And the UK clearly expects preferential treatment, non-MFN treatment on pharmaceuticals. What else? happens. And then there's the question of all others. If you're Moldova or Lesotho, what in the world do you get? Something that was issued and then suspended in early April? Or what do you do in the meantime? Do you bring a lot of presents to Washington? That it's gift season, and it's more blessed to give than to receive. And there's a lot of hoovering up of gifts that may take place. Um, the uh, the I think what we're seeing is a change in trade patterns globally. The U.S. has decided to opt out of full participation in trade, global trade, at 10% base rate. Now, there'll be exchange rate movements, but the exchange rate situation is very complicated because the U.S. is moving away from being the dominant currency at the same time as it's putting on tariffs. If you put on tariffs, you should get an appreciation of the dollar, and that takes out about half the figure, economists figure, of the effect of the 10% tariff, if that's what we're settling towards. And I don't think, by the way, that we're settling for a 10%, settling towards, that the administration is settling towards a 10% tariff for China. There's 10%, that's the base rate, plus 20% for fentanyl. Fentanyl can be solved. The Chinese government can be very good about uh, increasing pressures on any trade in fentanyl and its precursors. But if you solve fentanyl, I don't believe that the 20% going away puts China at a 10% level. This president campaigned on a 10 or 20% tariff on the world and a 60% tariff on China. We're at 49% without all of the sectoral tariffs. So we're in that range. We're closing close to 60% in some ways. And is that where it settles out? And my suspicion is that won't be terribly welcome in China or accepted. A big question down the road is, do the Democrats differ? Uh, does this get all rolled back in 3 years, or the what used to be the Republican Party, parts of the Republican Party that were really free trade, are they able to muster a more trade liberalizing attitude? Uh, so a very good question is the amount of systemic damage that's done. Are others going to emulate the UK and what may be what China does? We'll see. With respect to bilateral deals, we don't know. The initial hanging over all of this is for Europe, Ukraine, for Japan, defense, and Philippines and others, and Korea, South Korea. Um, and out of WTO, besides the Director General, there's silence. The Director General has talked about repositioning with some really thoughtful changes that are very different than what's in the GATT and the Marrakesh Agreement. Um, uh, does the system go towards repositioning? So far, Geneva seems to be absent from the fray, near as I can tell. And Sean Kuhn will tell us that no, 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 it's about to revive and dramatically impress us with forward motion, which we all would applaud. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Alan. Yeah, let's. I look forward to hearing about the forward motion. That's good. No, I mean you raised a whole, some tremendous issues. Yeah, there the EU position, Japan, legal challenges in the US, the baseline, the 10% baseline, currency issues, and the relative absence of Geneva. So I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those points. But first of all, let me now turn to Ignacio. I think he's probably going to enlighten us on the EU part of that conundrum. Ignacio, over to you.
Select Stuart, and I'm not talking for the EU anymore. So when I talk about the EU, I will just be giving my educated guess of what I think should happen, but it's not not more than that. Now, I think it's really, I would try to basically focus my intervention first on the US-China and comments, very briefly on the UK-US. I will then give you my sense about what I think the EU approach could be. And then I hope to be able to say something about the most critical issue, which is what is the implication that all of this is having for the multilateral trading system. Now, the first thing to say about the US-China deal is that it is a relief. I mean, a situation in which there would have been a two-way embargo between the US and China would have been hugely destructive for the US economy, very destructive for the Chinese economy, and very destructive for the global economy. So the fact that both sides have managed to pull back from the brink is undoubtedly good news. I mean, I'm not going to enter into the whole question about who blinked first, but I would just note one thing. From the very beginning of the trade war, already starting in round one, China has throughout maintained a strategy of only negotiating on a position of balance and following, therefore, tit-for-tat retaliation. That is what China did on the 301s during Trump 1. And at the end of the day, the agreement that was reached by both sides maintains this principle because China applies retaliation to the 10% reciprocal tariffs. So from that point of view, the negotiation between the US and China is happening on a situation in which both sides are in a balanced position. Now, how far can this go? I tend to agree that the deal on fentanyl is possible. And of course, if a deal on fentanyl is possible, my calculation is that this would imply a 10% tariff for about 25% of China trade. That is to say, for those tariff lines that were not subject to the 301. And for the other, it would be a tariff rate of up to 45%, except for the very high tariff that were introduced by the Biden administration. Which, by the way, for me, this is a question, because 45% is not a strategic decoupling tariff rate. So it's actually what strategic decoupling means, what all of this is going to imply. I think it would be interesting to see. Now, for me, the main concern about the US-China deal is what comes next. There's no clarity whatsoever what are going to be the negotiations between the US and China. But of course, there's a very, very serious risk that it will be based on a managed trade approach, like was the case to a large extent with phase one. Not fully, because there were some structural components of phase one, but it is difficult to see how the deeper structural issues relating to China are going to be tackled in a bilateral negotiation. So there is some indication that at least the US sees this negotiation as something that would be based on a combination of purchase commitments, export restraints, investment commitments. So essentially a managed trade approach. And that is something that obviously can have significant implications for third countries that will also need to be followed carefully. Now, I will be very, very brief on the UK-United States deal. It is problematic at least on two accounts. It is problematic because it is not a balanced deal. Basically, the UK is offering improved access to its market to the United States, and the United States is applying the 10% import surcharge on all trade from the United Kingdom. So that's simply not something which can be presented as balanced. I therefore am quite convinced that it would not be a template for whatever deal can be reached between the European Union and the United States, because if there's something that the European Union is always going to be extremely careful, is to ensure that any negotiated outcome can be presented as being balanced in nature. And secondly, there's of course the issue that it undermines the MFN principle at the moment in which MFN is subject to an existential threat. And therefore, it is quite problematic, particularly this is going to be the first of a series of instances in which countries decide MFN does not apply anymore, at least when it comes to relations with the United States. Now, as I said, I do not really know I do not have any inside knowledge about what the European Union is going to do. I can tell you what I would expect to happen. I mean, you would note that the European Union has finally decided to launch a WTO dispute settlement case against the reciprocal tariffs. I think it's good news. I don't know why it took so long, but I think it's good that this has now been put forward for a request for consultations in Geneva. The political decision that would need to be taken at some point in time is whether to wait until the outcome of a dispute settlement case to retaliate against the reciprocal tariffs or to do it earlier. My personal advice, and it's only my personal advice because it will be a political decision, would be that if the tariffs stay at 10%, you can wait for the outcome of the WTO dispute settlement case. If the tariffs were going to be increased to a higher level, discriminated against the European Union, then I think, in my view, the European Union would be ready to retaliate immediately. But that, I said, is just my own personal advice. I don't have any inside knowledge about how the European Union would react on that. Since it is very clear that there is not any flexibility or very limited flexibility on the 10%, I imagine that a lot of the discussions at this point in time are trying to assess what flexibility is there or not on the 232s, both those which have already been applied, but also what is going to happen on pharmaceuticals, an extremely important sector for the European Union. My impression is that there was going to be a solution on the 232s, on all the 232s, then potentially it is possible to have some form of agreement between the European Union and the United States. If there's no solution on the 232s, then I think it's very clear, in my view, that the European Union would need to apply rebalancing action in relation to the different 232 measures. Now, if there was going to be an agreement, what could this agreement include? I personally do not really see what it is that the European Union can or should offer on tariffs, because, as I said before, the situation is going to be one in which in practically all products, US tariffs are higher than the European Union tariffs. So how can you politically justify giving an additional tariff concession to the United States in those circumstances? But I don't really see tariffs as being something that would be part of the offer of the European Union in those circumstances. I can see the scope for doing something on LNG. I can see the scope of doing something on regulatory issues, provided that it is balanced and it is consistent with the European Union regulatory framework. So I still have a little bit of time, so I would like to make some comments on the implication that all of this has for the multilateral trading system. I would distinguish between the short term and the medium term. In the short term, I think it's really very important that there is a coalition of countries which is sufficiently broad, that is very clear on 2 points. One is the need to abide by the current rules of the WTO, and the second one is that these rules and the WTO as an institution needs fundamental reform. I think it is good that, for instance, apparently there's going to be a dialogue between the EU and the CPTPP, because this would be 2 important components of trying to develop this coalition. Not the only one, but 2 important components in trying to develop this coalition. I think it's also important to think strategically about NC14, because a ministerial meeting of the WTO with no outcomes would be another nail in the coffin of the reputation of the WTO. It's going to be very difficult to see what it is that can be agreed in the current circumstances, but I believe that an effort needs to be made to identify a number of areas where some kind of result can be achieved by NC14. But if one looks up to this much more deeply, Stuart, as you actually did, yes, I think that we are in a moment which is as existential for the multilateral trading system as the moment when the Uruguay round was launched. Probably even more, because actually the threat it is much bigger than it was in the 80s. And I think that incrementalism as a strategy for WTO reform has reached its limit. I think one really needs to start to be thinking of a rather fundamental reform of the WTO, or repositioning of the WTO, whatever word you want to use. It's not something that is going to happen in the short term, but you really need to be thinking about issues such as subsidies. Subsidies on the industrial sector now are as important, if not more, the subsidies on agriculture were when the Uruguay round was launched. The whole question of economic security. All countries are now taking measures for economic security reasons, and no one really knows what is the relationship between those measures and the WTO. The balance of market access commitment that was negotiated in the Uruguay round is not valid anymore, and we are likely to see all kinds of derogations from that balance. The WTO as a negotiating forum will not survive unless it is open to unilateral agreements. And dispute settlement is not going to be fixed unless you actually fix also the four other issues. So I think you have a rather fundamental situation for the WTO. I don't think that we are going to find a solution on that by MC14, but I think it's important to start thinking about much more fundamentally what is the type of reform global trading system that can actually work if there's a political will by the big players to negotiate on rules.
Many thanks indeed, Ignacio. That's great. Your advice to the EU and the Commission was crystal clear. I'm sure that that's going to be taken into account to the correct extent. And also your thoughts on the WTO are very, very valuable. I'm sure we'll come back to that as well. Can I now move on to Lou, to you to provide the third part of our trilateral discussion today?
Thanks, Stuart. I will focus very much on China, US, and then in between relate to a little bit part of the UK, US, and I will say a few words about the multilateral front also. On China, US, the last weekend kind of joint statement was, of course, as you said, and Alan said, that exceeded expectations. And especially if we consider the kind of highly politicized rhetorics between the two sides. So in a sense, it does have a positive sense in a few aspects. So the first thing is that by reducing the kind of reckless escalated kind of tariff before April 2nd, a big margin, 5%, 91% abolished and 24% suspended for 90 days. And also the agreed kind of abolishing or suspending non-tariff barriers. So make China-US trade again possible. And the Chinese figures tells that in April, Chinese export to the US dropped by as high as 21%. And a few friends of mine who are in trade exporting to the US told me that just a few hours after the deal, so it was like early morning in China, midnight in Geneva, they already received telephone calls from their American importers saying that I place this order now and you deliver it immediately. And so, and also said that the both sides are going to continue this negotiation within the 90 days of transition. And they are talking about in the next few weeks, so which is also positive. And so as to talk about what we are discussing here, the fentanyl tariff of 20% and other non-tariff barriers on each other. And the other thing which is also significant for me is that the change of rhetorics on both sides. And they both call the Geneva negotiation constructive, and surprisingly say that our difference are not as big as we thought. And the US say that that neither side seek decoupling. And funny, quite interestingly, they even talk about common interests and commit for mutual respect. So these are the things that we never hear in the past, at least quite some years to come. So I think that this, as I said in the past, put probably China-US relationship in a positive framework without which it would be difficult to discuss a bilateral relationship and also on specific issues. The third thing, as said by Alan and Ignacio, Alan especially, is that the so-called Geneva mechanism, which is established, and they underline that they will continue to build upon that mechanism to enhance communication, avoid misunderstanding, and also the kind of escalation that we have been witnessing. If this mechanism is continued as sustained, probably we could see at least a first steps to start re-talking to each other, rebuild, probably not quickly, the mutual political confidence, and then avoids kind of ups and downs and back and forth and the related uncertainty. The thing is that is this the moment to celebrate? Having said all that, I think that probably a word of caution that we are far from that. First, that of course the uncertainty is far from being removed. And you heard that last Wednesday at our also FMG session, both WTO-IMF reports demonstrated how big damaging this uncertainty could do to both sides and global economy. As said by US, this Geneva meeting was just a de-escalation. And do we expect more for next 90 days or beyond negotiations? If nothing happened, would we restore this 24% of FTA now? And there's still a lot of uncertainty. Actually, the US importers jumped out of their bed and placing their orders immediately. I think what I heard is that worries about the uncertainty come after 90 days if nothing happens. The bilateral mechanism, of course, is good to see them re-established, but we should not forget that actually it was during Trump 1.0 that the so-called China-US strategic and economic dialogue was abolished by him. And days after, he and Chinese President Xi established a new mechanism in Mar-a-Lago, and then that was abolished again. And so this new mechanism, can it continue and be sustained in the long term? We don't know. The US say that they don't seek decoupling, but as you say, that basically did distinguish between the common products, textiles, others, and then high-tech products or strategic products. And just 1 day after the Geneva talk on 13th, US announced a new directive, a new so-called AI diffusion rule, basically targeting China again, and which is said by many to be even more restrictive than the abolished Biden time AI diffusion rule, including on the kind of scrutiny on the supply chain and also. And China almost on the same day also announced that they will strengthen the export control on critical minerals, including the rare earth, and to crack down in illegal trafficking of such materials. So the decoupling is said no, but something is still going on. And also how this bilateral China-US tension extends to other bilateral relationships. And you guys have been talking about these strategic sectors, including steel, aluminum, and also pharmaceuticals. And there it did say that the UK will, as soon as possible, satisfy the US request on supply chain security and also ownership of production facilities. And many say that this is forcing the UK to take sides. And many others, would they follow? We don't know. China, as I said, that have already issued very firm warning saying that if anything like this happens, detrimental to third parties increase like China, they will take actions. And I read the news saying that China is already approaching UK to seek clarification. And the last word on the bilateral, I will repeat here, so forgive me for that. But as I said many times in the past, the fundamental deep rooted kind of structural problem between China and the US, what I call in the past 10 years, so-called systemic confrontation, and is not resolved. And the mutual political distrust and also the kind of trade tensions so may continue. And the question to the US is always the same. would they allow the coexistence of different systems, including within the WTO, or would they seek to force a convergence of different systems? And then the question on China's side, of course, is still the same question for the past 20 years, is that whether China will continue its domestic reform to control the spilling over effects of its peculiar economic system, and do things in international organizations. As Chinese President Xi said in 2018 in Shanghai that they can negotiate any issues like industrial policies, subsidies, state-owned enterprises, so on and so forth. But for the moment, we don't see, how to say, concrete examples of that. The final word is about how does this relate to the multilateral. Of course, if you look at both agreements, deals, is that UK probably is more prone to undermining WTO basic rules like MFN. China is not clear, but as said that the negotiation will continue. So would that, how say, entail more non-MFN measures? We don't. China has done it with the US under phase 1, so we don't know whether that would continue in the future. US did make it very clear after the Geneva talk that they would seek more purchasing contracts, and that would be exactly something we experts think should be avoided as non-MFN. And the other thing is that even China, US has reduced their tariff by 115%. But if you put everything together, I mean, on the US side, the MFN tariff, 10% baseline and 20% fertile, and then all these 301, 232. So based on some Chinese experts, the US tariff on China is as high as 53%. And China, vice versa, is similar, is 33%. So this is still go beyond their WTO tariff binding, and which of course will create a lot of problems for bilateral trade. Last thing is that all these bilaterals, are they notified to the WTO? Do we have a dedicated mechanism in the WTO to talk about this? Alan asked for some Geneva information. The only thing I heard is that next Monday, the General Council chair will organize an informal house meeting to discuss this kind of tension and possibly maybe the bilaterals. But my question to them is why don't we establish a kind of specific mechanism like we did in 2008 after the crisis, kind of monitor mechanism of these tensions, so on and so forth. The last word is that when everybody is rushing to DC for bilateral negotiations, how do we do WTO reform? How do we sustain the multilateral system? And how do we, as Alan and Ignacio say that, try to keep the other members' bilateral trade under MFN and WTO rules, so on and so forth? We don't know. So my last word is that April 2nd will be marked in the WTO history as quite an important day. I mean, important not in positive sense. What I think encourage you to reflect upon is that this so-called Liberation Day, how could we avoid it to be a kind of hibernation day for the multilateral system and the WTO reform? So I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Lou. And I like your contrast between liberation and hibernation. That's great stuff. Much appreciated. Well, we've had 3 very, very substantive contributions from our panelists. You know, I got lots more questions, as I'm sure you do, but I think what I'm going to do now is actually open the floor to anybody who wants to throw in a comment based on what they've heard. That includes the panelists too, because they may want to add something to what they've already said. But we've got about 3/4 of an hour, so I'm hoping we can have a really good exchange between ourselves on this fascinating subject. And so I'm going to open the floor. And first of all, I'm going to give the floor to Wendy Cutler, who's on the line. I think Wendy has to leave quite soon, so I think it's good if she can get her comments in first. Over to you, Wendy.
Well, thanks, Stuart, and really thanks to the previous three speakers. Gave me a lot of food for thought, and I've been studying both of these announcements. And I do not use the term deals here because these are not deals in the way I used to understand them. Stuart, you asked a question about, is the UK deal a template? And from my view, I think the answer is yes and no. So I think other countries can benefit from looking at the structure of this deal. And that includes kind of what I would call terms of reference for the next phase of detailed negotiations. And here I read some piece that the word intend is used 17 times in this 5-page document. And I just find it, hilarious. It's even like we intend to cooperate on certain issues. Like, why can't we just cooperate and get rid of those words? But it also does include some early deliverables with non-MFN tariff cuts. And so, I think that structure is going to be important. And of course, it includes a 10% baseline rate. Now, in certain areas, I just want to highlight three where maybe it cannot be used as a template and time will tell. And this is what other countries are really looking at now. I'll call them the anti-China provisions, but the word China does not appear anywhere. But folks have already referenced the U.S. the provisions on living up to U.S. requirements on investments and supply chains, which definitely suggests that there is going to be an effort in the detailed negotiations to strengthen rules of origin. But my sense is for many Asian countries, we may be asking even more here. And so they can look at these provisions, but I suspect there'll be a big emphasis on bolstering transshipment and anti-circumvention provisions, among others. The second area, and here I highlight, particularly given the FT's article on negotiations with Japan kind of stalling now, and that is, will these sectoral 232s be on the table? Japan apparently has been told no, but the UK has definitely gotten a break, not only on auto tariffs, but there seems to be some deal in the works on steel and aluminum. And there's even language on how the two sides can deal once a pharmaceutical 232 announcement is made. So this does open the door, and I think for including sectoral tariffs in these negotiations. And even if the US wants to cabin that off to the UK, I think they've made that job more difficult. The other point I would just make is, let's recall that during Trump 1.0, there were FTA negotiations between the UK and US. And so when they talk about, the detailed negotiations, they're referring to a lot of areas like labor, environment, digital, et cetera. I'm not sure that will be on the table for others. We'll need to see. Then let me just turn then briefly to the China announcement. I think, it definitely exceeded expectations. And so there was a lot of euphoria this past weekend about this announcement. But now that things have settled down a bit, particularly in the US, there is a lot of criticism that the US did not really get a lot for this announcement and unwinding the tariffs. And that may put pressure on the administration to make sure that during these 90-day negotiations that we secure, a defensible package. I think these the notion we're going to negotiate some kind of meaningful deal with China in a 90-day period, which overlaps with all our other negotiations with other countries, is just going to be a bridge too far. So I suspect as long as we're making progress with China and China, and in our view, China, or the administration's view, China is negotiating in good faith, I think there will be multiple rollovers of this negotiating period. But these negotiations are going to be extremely difficult. First, I'm not sure the US even knows what it wants coming from a deal with China. You hear Secretary Besson talking about wanting to have like a rebalancing deal that gets at a lot of structural issues. I suspect others, including Greer, will probably want to be more pragmatic and look for concrete things China can do. Unlike the phase one deal, however, I'm sure China's going to come to the table with lots of requests as well, and will want a more balanced deal than phase one, which was almost 90% in the US favor. So that's going to complicate things, particularly if China wants to put export controls and shipping fees and other things like that on the table. That's going to really complicate the talks as well. And then I would just say, just from bandwidth resource perspective, again, the U.S. negotiators are going to be very hard pressed. Again, I think a U.S.-China deal could be a full-time job for most of them. I just want to conclude and say that what I'm hearing from other countries, and this gets to something that Alan said, is a fear that if China were to move on fentanyl and we successfully, our concerns are successfully addressed, then that conceivably could reduce the China tariff to lower rates than many other trading partners, including some of our allies. And so other countries are very concerned about this. On one hand, they welcome this de-escalation between the US and China, but I think they're also a little wary that they don't want to be the ones who end up with higher tariff rates than China. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. That's fabulous. And thanks for sparing the time. I know you have a busy day coming up. It's great. But I thought, you injected a sort of concrete note of reality there about, multiple rollovers might be expected and the complexity of the whole situation, which I think is very, very interesting. So thanks very much for that. Well, the floor is still open if anybody wants to chip in. I don't know if Cecilia is still on the call. She was on earlier, but I was hoping, if not now, then a little bit later, to see if she could say something about WTO reform and the need to do something about that, because I think she's been fairly vocal on that, but perhaps she's dropped off the call by now. So as I say, the floor is still open for anybody who would like to say something. Lou, if I could come back to you, maybe just while we're waiting for somebody to put their hands up. You were talking about that China has approached, perhaps you understand, approached the UK to express some concern or to seek clarification about these provisions in the economic prosperity deal with the US relating to economic security. And I mean, I thought when you said that, that maybe it would not come as a surprise to many people or many countries around the world that the UK and the US would be fairly close in this area, because they always have been. To what extent maybe is it China trying to take some preemptive action to warn other countries against this type of thing? Can you maybe make a comment on that?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And this is, of course, not just an issue on UK. This is an issue or a kind of Chinese warning towards many other countries who may be negotiating with the US on these bilaterals. I mean, we have seen many, at least reading from newspaper, I think those targeted countries which may most probably be kind of forced to take sides. in these bilaterals would be like Mexico, Canada, and also the Vietnam and others. So as I said, both Foreign Affairs and MOVCOM kind of spokesperson have made it very clear if such things happens, that they will take actions. Of course, we have seen this not only now, we have seen this previously between China and Australia, and also between China and Canada, when there was some other, including some non-trade, security, military kind of alliance was done during Trump 1.0 and also Biden administration time. So those things, which I think worries me very much, because especially the China-Australia, which they have a FTA, but the bilateral trade was fiercely interrupted because of such a kind of taking sides and then punitive measures by China. So this is something we need to wait and see. I don't think China will take any preemptive measures, except that by talking to these countries through their bilateral channels, like what they are doing with the UK. But I think China is fully prepared that if anything like this happens, they will take actions in a responsive manner. How that it is, how big it is, how fierce it is, for the moment, I don't know. Again, this is my personal view. I don't have inside information, but based on my experiences for the past, how to say, kind of incidents. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lou. I'll give the floor now back to Alan, and then Ignacio after that.
You know, looking back at history, the last two rounds of the GATT, Tokyo and Uruguay, were caused by an obstreperous United States. The Nixon surcharge, which is now actually being looked at by the U.S. courts as an example of what the authority should be like declaring a national emergency. So it's the Nixon surcharge is back before us in the courts as a precursor, as it was, to the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which the president has used for the tariffs in most cases. So you can, out of a crisis, you can pull something good out of it. It was a different United States. And the question is whether the EU, China, others are up to the challenge of looking at this multilaterally. And no evidence of that whatsoever. We're in the sauve qui peut, save yourself if you can, phrase of this the suspension of the tariffs. So I don't sense anybody is thinking of rushing off to Geneva with a major proposal. You have a new Canadian government. They have to find their footing. The Ottawa Group eventually. Canada has been so important in the past to it was it that fostered the idea that John Jackson gave them of having a WTO. It wasn't called a WTO at that point, but we wouldn't have a WTO if it weren't for Canada, and if it wasn't for the EU picking up on it. I don't think it was done all that well, constitutionally speaking, but it was mainly about dispute settlement, binding dispute settlement. But Lou raised the point of Xi Jinping talking about the ability of China to evolve in terms of its economic organization. That's certainly, it's in background. I don't know if it's on the table, but it's in the background of all of this, always. As you said in your introduction, April 2nd made a major difference. Not necessarily a positive one, but the world is a different place. The world of trade is a different place, and the WTO hasn't come to grips with it. I think we're going to have mainly bilateral focus of everything for the time being. And I hope that China takes a broader view as to others going forward. We need that. We're not going to have sensible negotiated agreements, very thoughtfully constructed, as Wendy has indicated, in the remainder of this 90-day period. But what has happened? Trump says, well, we have a great process going, so we're still talking to the UK. We have a great process going, so we're talking still to China. How to stitch in all the other countries in the planet. We're going to see whether USTR is going to say, well, we now have a process going in a month or a month and a half with Korea, with Japan, with others, and whether there's an extension of the suspension. What's shocking to me, as I said a little bit earlier, is that the tariffs are still historically quite high, higher than Smoot-Hawley rates with respect to China. And the trade is saying, fantastic. Compared with what it was, it's a reopening of the borders. It's just great. Well, we'll see whether what the shipping containers headcount looks like going forward. But we don't want to get used to living with tariffs at that level, I would hope. Lastly, the idea that everyone's going to trade around the United States is a splendid idea. The U.S. is unreliable. There's a great uncertainty. That's a tariff in its own right, except for one thing. The U.S. is the second largest, or the first largest in terms of GDP in the world. China's second. U.S. is first, China's second. And by a large margin, we are great consumers. We are the world's greatest consumers. And the idea that a 10% or 20% tariff is going to diminish to the point of exhaustion or extinction the U.S. as the consumer of last resort, just because I'm all for CPTPP and EU coming together, but they're not going to overnight replace the United States as their market of choice. Canada, sitting on our north border with just simple ability to take a truck across the border, is not going to replace the rest of the world if we don't screw it up too badly. And we don't know what the answer will be in terms of the survival of USMCA, the old NAFTA. So the world is changing to a degree, but it's not the end of trade. What we've lost is our rules. And we've lost also the ability to think through what should the rules be. Ending on that one note, and that is, Ngozi said, we have to recognize that excessive dependence in some products might not be acceptable. Well, where does that fit into the rules, the current rules? The U.S. doesn't want to depend on Taiwan for the most advanced chips, nor South Korea for that matter. The argument used to be about dependence on others for steel, and it's moved on to other things. AI, the U.S., I mean, there is a services agreement. What countries want to rely solely on other countries other than themselves for all access with respect to AI and its supporting devices. So, but is anyone thinking in those terms now? Not yet. So it's up to us, the FMG.
Thanks, Alan. Passing the back to the FMG now, I see. Okay. I'd just like to point out there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. One is from Fakri Al-Hazaima. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but he's saying, are we sure that we're moving in the right direction towards WTO reform, despite all of what's happening at the bilateral level, especially with the USA? And then we have another question from Peter van den Bosch, who's got a bad internet connection. So he's coming at us in writing saying, one, has the US been able to conclude any other deal than the deal with the UK? Two, is it realistic, given the complexity of negotiations, that many deals which the US would consider good enough and others acceptable to be concluded within 90 days? Three, if not, are we going to see a repeated extension of the 90-day pause? So I think Wendy seemed to say that that might be likely. But anyway, if there are any other comments on that, please, panelists or others, please say something about that. Now I'm going to give the floor to Ignacio, followed by Alejandro, and then Lou.
Yes, well, actually, I thought you might want to give it before to Alejandro because he hasn't spoken yet. So
Yes, okay, Alejandro, you're getting priority treatment as ever on the FMG.
Thank you. And thanks all to have today's panelists, fantastic presentations, very useful. I'd like to give my takeaway from all this, from these two deals, is that the United States has drifted away from the system, from the WTO. To paraphrase Alan Wolf, the United States is not only checking out, but I think it has checked out. It has done everything with no respect, nothing, no reference to WTO at all. And it seems to me that whatever they are doing, they don't intend to follow, and to use the word intend again, to follow the WTO rules. And not only that, but the United States, except for Canada and Mexico, has also thrown away its bilateral free trade agreements with Peru, with Australia, with Chile, Singapore, and so on and so forth. So they're out, and we have to adapt to that. So it's very important now that the rest, and I understand that all countries, most, that will negotiate something with the United States, that those countries, the UK, China, and everyone else, whatever they do with the United States, that they abide by the WTO rules. I think that's very important to preserve the WTO at least. And so I think that the news coming out from the CPTPP meeting is good in terms that they show willingness to engage with the EU and with ASEAN countries to preserve the system and to begin a process to reform the system. It's not a trade agreement between those countries, but it's a process that has to be credible and has to have political support. And I think that has to be highlighted. But to me, the implication is the United States, at least until such time as they want to come back, they're out of the system. When we should think, when we think of WTO, it's without the United States. It's not our choice, but it's been its choice. Thank you.
Can I just come back to you quickly on that one, Alejandro? It just occurred to me, putting together what you said, which I very much liked also, with what something that Wendy said earlier, because when you look at CPTPP, if you look at, say, a country like, say, Vietnam, which I think is a member of the CPTPP, the US is going to, according to Wendy, come fairly hard at countries like Vietnam on circumvention, all of that sort of stuff, rules of origin, probably this is already happening. So it's going to be a difficult situation to navigate between, you know, doing the right thing, if you like, on the one hand, and surviving vis-a-vis the US on the other. So how do you see, or would you like to make a comment on that aspect?
Well, I would not be surprised in that respect that Vietnam take actions to protect itself and to strike agreements or try to do something to minimize whatever action the United States is taking against its exports. Now, what is important in the context of what I said is that whatever Vietnam does with regards to the United States, that will not affect Vietnam's obligations with the rest of the world, with the rest of the WTO world. Even if Vietnam's action in the United States would be as WTO incompatible as the actions of the United States vis-a-vis Vietnam. But I think that the rest of the world should conduct their trade in accordance with WTO, regardless of what they do to the United States or with the United States.
I see what you mean. Thank you very much for that. Now back to you, Ignacio, and then Lou after that.
Sorry, I'm glad to talk after Alejandro because in a way he has mentioned something which I really also wanted to go back to, because I think that what is going to be really important for the trading system between now and NC14 is to try to have as many countries as possible doing their best to stay within the rules of the system. Now, we all know there are going to be huge pressures, and I think that clearly the situation for a country like Vietnam is going to be extremely difficult. And to be very, very blunt, what the UK has agreed to do will make the life of Vietnam more difficult if they really want to try to avoid giving something to the United States that is clearly contrary to WTO rules, and that we may harm the interests of certain countries. After all, you may find certain countries that have worse access to the Vietnamese market than the United States does as a consequence of these concessions. So to a certain extent, the interests of certain countries may well be affected, but in doing the best to try to limit to the maximum extent feasible any departures, but also thinking strategically about how those countries can, at this point in time, try to collectively exercise some leadership in the WTO. And that's why I think that MC14 is so important. A failed MC14, in my view, would really be terrifying for the reputation of the WTO. It's going to be very difficult, but I think that, in my view, one really needs to be thinking at least on some kind of development package that protects the situation of the more vulnerable developing countries in the current situation of high tensions in the global trading system, and at least some recognition that the issue of subsidies is existential, both on industrial and agriculture, and that work is to intensify in the WTO to discuss how to move forward on issues relating to subsidies. And really, those two issues, I think, in my view, hopefully would come from NC14. And I think that, by the way, for me, UCPTPP is not just a way of facilitating trade between the EU and the CTPP countries. It's also much more about thinking strategically about how these countries can cooperate with others to promote a substantial WTO reform agenda, knowing that, as Alejandro has said, a substantial WTO reform really needs to wait until there is the right political conditions, which are not likely to be there at least until the end of this administration. Who knows what would be the situation afterwards? But in the meantime, you also need to do something, and that's why also I think you can look into the UCTPP as an incubator for rules. There are areas which might not be possible at this point in time to negotiate in the WTO, like a digital trade agreement, that you might be able to do it in a UCPTPP country as open plurilateral agreements that could be integrated in the WTO once the conditions for those integrations have been established, which is not going to happen necessarily in the very short term, but which could hopefully be a medium-term perspective, because without that, the WTO has no future as a negotiating forum.
Thanks, Ignacio. Great. And thank you for raising the development package idea. I mean, I think this is something that's is being a bit overlooked, quite frankly. So that's good to hear. There was an interesting article, by the way, that I read in Foreign Affairs recently about the demise of the aid industry, as they called it. I can't remember the authors, unfortunately, but we'll try to look that up. But it was basically saying that maybe there's a silver lining to the current situation, in that maybe what was called the aid industrial complex will be kind of downgraded, and that aid may be more directly delivered in future. I don't know, but I thought that was an interesting point, and I'm really glad you raised it. Thanks, Ignacio. Lou, please.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I just want to respond a little bit to the question by this Mr. Ali Hazaim on whether we are moving in the right direction towards the WTO reform. I'm much happy said by Alejandro and Alan and Ignacio. I just want to compliment by first saying that my answer, of course, is very much no. I don't think we are moving in the right direction after almost 10 years talking about this and 2 years formally launching this in the WTO. I mean, right now, you see much going on this firefighting. And as we discussed, a lot of bilaterals could be non-MFN and could be anti-China discriminatory. We also see quite a big rush towards more FTAs, including by EU and others, and also expansion by existing ones like CPTPP and RCEP. And we have also seen many more happening outside of the WTO, like DEPA, like SECTS on environment, so on and so forth. So this, of course, as we all know, that allowed by under the WTO under Article 24, Article 5 of GATT and GAS. But if this goes on without movement on the WTO side, and then this will be kind of not complementary but detrimental to the system. We all know that. The other thing is that the reason we are not moving in the direction as said by others is that we don't have a leadership role here. And we say that we want the collective leadership role by middle grounders. But for the moment, we see some discussion on that, but we don't see that coming. And from what we heard, that even for those middle grounders, some of them are even afraid of joining in the force because of this Trump fear. If they do something like that, they will be deemed as anti-Trump and then be punished. I mean, as the April 10th, the joint statement by the Friends of the System, which was not that many co-sponsors. And of course, in the past, we always say on WTO reform that is reform by doing and incremental and so on and so forth. But we don't see many things happening. I mean, especially on negotiating front. I mean, what DG said, as Alan mentioned, the repositioning of the WTO, is that a new direction? What does it mean? We don't know. And I don't think many ambassadors know about that either. And we have been saying that we need a political dialogue so as to tackle the fundamental kind of deeply rooted structural problems. And we don't see that yet in place. And ministers are still meeting, but they are talking, but not that kind of dialogue we are wanting. We want to see, as Alan and others say, that we should be a kind of talking about this deeply rooted and with a kind of fundamental change of mindset about WTO, its positioning and its reform, and so on and so forth. And the last word is that many leaders or ministers are short-sighted because of election, domestic politics, so on and so forth. So we see that in many countries, both developed and developing. And so we always say that, okay, private sector should be the force to utilize and mobilize them, so on and so forth. But we don't yet see a proper channel of communication with the WTO or its members, a kind of systemic, regular thing. We don't see that. So we don't see a kind of strong voice from private sector yet on the WTO reform. So putting all of this together, I don't think we're moving in the right direction. And of course, last but not least, I agree very much with Ignacio about the developmental aspect. And we do see a kind of grouping of developed countries, including China, with this so-called Global South initiative and working with developed countries here and there. But we don't yet see a kind of clear-cut, well-thought package from any southern countries about what do they want as on the WTO reform with this kind of new reality and background. So I don't see that. So anyway, long story short, we're not moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Lou. Well, that's a bit depressing, but that's probably the right reading, I must say. I give the floor now to Jonathan.
Well, thanks to all for the thoughtful interventions. Although there's an undercurrent of frustration, if not despair, that's pervading the discussion. It's late in the day in the session, so let me just flag a couple of things that might be topical for future consideration. One, most of this discussion has been about framed in institutional terms. What do we do about the WTO, about its processes? Looking back at history, and Alan has flagged some countries having taken the initiative to help get WTO discussions going for the 7 years that followed for the Uruguay round. But the other thing that happened was topical and subject matter initiatives. The whole agricultural tariffication effort came together because a number of countries triggered very constructive analytical work outside Geneva. It originated in an OECD work program. We know in good measure what the major issues are that are gaps in the current rule book, from industrial subsidies to the continuing overhang of agriculture, to the digital age, and so on. It seems to me that like-minded countries who appreciate what the agenda should be looking beyond the confines of Geneva and beyond the confines of trying to get things done within the WTO to trigger that kind of analysis, consensus building, evidence-based support for what's needed in the fora that can help advance those agendas. That still includes the OECD. They're doing wonderful work on subsidies, as you know. We should look at the informal fora, be it APEC or engaging with the expanded BRICS Plus, and so on. So observation number one is, let's come back to what does that inventory look like and where can the subject matters be advanced in terms of thinking. That also includes the public policy community and non-governmental analysis and fora. The second observation that I do think we should come back to is to put the WTO in the context of the turmoil affecting many of the international organizations. None of us have seen the detailed reports that were submitted to the president on April 1st or 2nd, following his executive order to review all international organizations, including the WTO. We've seen precipitous action on the WHO and so on. Scott Bessent had some very harsh words about both the IMF and the World Bank getting back to basics. You've flagged what's happening, yes, to the development industry, but to the development institutions. And Mia may wish to weigh in. So alongside all of this, and partially in response to the funding crisis that they're facing, the Secretary General of the UN has launched a UN 80 initiative to take a comprehensive, fresh look at all the agencies, all the overlaps, all the intersections. There's even some undercurrent that it's time to merge the WTO and UNCTAD, for example. We may be, thanks to the Mar-a-Lago Accord dialogue, on the verge of having to have a Bretton Woods revisitation as well regarding the constellation of finance institutions, especially since both in development and debt terms and in terms of current account balances versus trade balances, the monetary arrangements are at issue as well. So it may be worth a discussion in one of our sessions at the WTO in context for both reasons I identified. I didn't mean to take up all the remaining time. These were meant to be triggers for future discussions. Thanks.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Jonathan. And I couldn't agree with you more about, we should stop focusing so much on the institution. I mean, one of the reasons I have so little hair left is I've tore quite a lot of it out over the years, reading G20 declarations talking about the WTO as if it's a sort of sick institution, when in fact the problem, of course, are the trade policies of its members. And so it's just a lightning rod that they can sort of deflect the blame onto. So
You
I think
you defeat the supposed truism, which is more people participate in the drafting of G20 communiques than read them. So you're changing the head count there.
maybe that's where I went wrong. Great. I think we can continue for 5 or 10 minutes if people want to. We still got a couple of minutes in any case, and I'll give the floor back to Ignacio.
Will be very, very brief because I think I totally agree with what Jonathan said. Before the Uruguay round was launched, there was a lot of intellectual groundwork to try to create the conditions to launch meaningful negotiations on the substance. That is what is needed now. It's not going to be so easy to do it institutionally in a place like the OECD. Maybe one also needs to be thinking about different key think tanks, how they can be thinking about how to reform multilateral economic governance, because I also agree with Jonathan, it's not just trade, it is also the international monetary order, it is also climate change. And I think the more that you can actually have groups of people thinking through what could be an ambitious but politically realistic program for reforming multilateral economic governance, when the conditions are there to move in that direction, I think those conditions could be generated. But you really need to be able to do the intellectual groundwork, because at this point in time, I think this is really missing.
Good, thanks very much, Ignacio. That's great. Just to point out that we've got a question in the chat, actually, from Rosine Blank, one of our members. Alan Wolf reminded us that no crisis should go unwasted, as the inflationary, perhaps stagflationary impact of increased tariffs becomes more apparent to US consumers, as well as the benefits of the deals more apparently performative. Do the panelists see any movement in US public opinion or the business community in favor of freer trade? That's an interesting one. Don't know if anybody wants to take that on. In the US, I mean, Alan, do you see any movement more back towards trade?
The business certainly hasn't left the idea of the movement of goods across borders. And the Trump administration's tariff policies have made, just as COVID-19 did, really, it taught us where trade is essential. So in COVID-19, we said, look at that. We don't have surgical gowns. And on the news, what they showed was hospital personnel converting trash bags into something to cover them while dealing with sick patients. because we don't have self-sufficiency in masks and gowns and the electronic ventilators. And it was an opportunity, I thought, for the WTO then, and it said so, for the WTO members. We had one good general council meeting during COVID. We came together and the members each took the floor. It was a single subject general council meeting on COVID. They said what were the problems they were facing individually, each country, each member, and we've had no follow-up. I mean, there was the TRIPS waiver discussion, which turned out to be irrelevant and always was. Enormous amount of effort went into designing a TRIPS waiver that didn't actually create places all around the world making vaccines. Now we have an opportunity again. We really do, and business does see that it's no damn good to have a tariff one day that is different than the tariff the next day, which is different than the tariff the day after that. And it's interesting to me, as I pointed out, that those in trade have decided I'm placing my orders during this time when I only have to pay a 45% tariff on goods from China. Isn't that splendid? And Temu and Shane are saying, look at that, the tariff's only 54%. And it may be more a little bit down the road. So ship as quickly as possible with enthusiasm, and we'll be able to later see the numbers on whether all those shipments really took place. But that's what the headlines are. The stock market is euphoric in the United States and in other countries that look at the whole problem solved because there's only 45% tariff between the U.S. and China. It's wildly different, but do they coalesce at some point and say, and does some members of the Congress, as they speak with them, say, well, from a U.S. point of view, we need something better. And I hope once things calm down bilaterally, that EU and CPTPP will say, yes, let's put something together as quickly as possible. And Ottawa Group comes back, participates fully, and there's a ferment, intellectual ferment, in favor of thinking through what sort of system do we need. And as the repositioning ideas of the DG, well, it's going to be a slightly different system. Europe is interested in where its natural gas comes from. It's been pointed out that's imperative. And the U.S., as I said, with semiconductors, has an issue. But with the 232s and the 301s, we'll be back in the impetus that created the two GATT rounds, the two last GATT rounds, the 7th and 8th rounds. So I think there are real possibilities here, and I hope that governments, once they solve the immediate problem of borders closing, potentially at the end of 90 days, that they turn to the medium term that Ignacio has talked about, and the longer term that he has also talked about, as has Lou. And I think Jonathan's idea of looking at what is the work that's been done is extremely important. It took years of effort of the Williams Commission on non-tariff barriers before non-tariff barriers were first attacked. It took years of work on services before the services agreement came into being. It's a long process, but there is good work out there, and It should be collected. One of the things that is close to the heart of Ngozi is the WTO being a knowledge hub, by which he doesn't mean that everything's done at the WTO. It means that through the WTO, members can access, no matter how small the member is, it can access good work that's being done elsewhere, because there will be people at the WTO who manage this. And for that, there really needs to be, one of the reform items is a stable budget. Use of the budget to control the agenda is not a healthy process now. So there's much to be done. There are real opportunities out there to do it in what looks like otherwise a very dismal picture, but there are real opportunities. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alan. I think we'll just try, if we can, quickly to squeeze in a couple of more contributions from Rosine, first of all, and then Mia.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I hope, I know this will be could be fertile ground for a new negotiations. And I'm hope that Alan is right, that we will see that and in renewed US leadership in the global role, global trade world. I do fear right now, however, that we're in a sauve-qui-peut situation, both domestically and internationally, where what is driving most of the action is to seek exemptions from the US high tariffs. And in that game, it's always the larger fry, the larger businesses, the larger countries can play rather than the smaller businesses, smaller countries, and smaller fry.
Good point. Thanks, Rosine. Mia?
I thank you, Stuart. I know it's very late. I just wanted to perhaps insert nano amount of optimism, because I'm just reading the EPIC issued joint statement of trade ministers, and they mention WTO in several paragraphs, but one says, we recognize the importance of the WTO to advance trade issues and acknowledge the agreed upon rules in the WTO as an integral part of the global trading system. We recognize the WTO has challenges and needs meaningful, necessary, and comprehensive reform to improve all its functions through innovative approaches to be more relevant and responsive in light of today's realities. So they also mention, of course, the fisheries subsidies agreement, GSIs, and electronic commerce, etc. So it's, I think, a great achievement that there was a joint statement. It was not a chair statement, and I think maybe there is a small ray of hope that some talks will be continuing in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mia. That's very helpful too. Well, I think the time has come where, to use the word of the day, I intend to close this session. But I give the floor back to Lou in a minute in case he wants to say something finally. I mean, impossible to sum up. You know, thank you very much for very, very thoughtful contributions from our panelists and everyone else. I just took, you know, two big things out of this session. One was, I think, that the complexity of the situation that we're facing now in a compressed time frame, and that maybe we've been feeling a certain sense of euphoria that the worst did not happen, but we now have to grapple with these very complex realities in the next 90 days and probably beyond, from what many of you are saying. That's one thing I took out of it. And the other one was that I just sensed that there's kind of like a bit of a shift in the feeling in the group. And it's not for me to really say this, but it's just a personal reflection. There's kind of a feel, you know, we used to talk about WTO reform, dispute settlement, and all of the other intricate things. Now I'm kind of getting a bit of a message from you that we need something more fundamental. So that's interesting. I mean, I think I just sense that there's a bit of a change in sentiment there, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, well, those are just a couple of my thoughts at the end of the session. Lou, would you like to have the last word before you intend to close the session?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. Just two quick words. First is, of course, that as you and others have said, that we FMG definitely need to follow very closely the next developments of these two agreements. There are further negotiations, but also other bilaterals that at least the US said that will be coming in the next few days, and probably we could develop a better idea about what they are and how they mean for the WTO. And the second thing is that, of course, that a kind of advertisement, because many people, including Jonathan, have said that we need more evidence-based, more in-depth analysis of things going on. And we definitely, FMG probably has the best experts around the world, for both North and South, and who can contribute to that process. And so for that, to whoever is interested, the governments or industries or think tanks, that we are here to help, and just contact me or anyone directly. That would be great help. Thank you very much. So we stay in touch and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.